The clock on Clara's dashboard read 6:27 p.m. as the last red light finally turned green. She took a long, deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart that had started 5 minutes ago. 3 consecutive texts from her husband, Michael, had lit up her screen. "Where are you?" Then, "Everyone's here." And the last one, "Don't embarrass me." Clara didn't reply. Her hands were shaking too much to type. Traffic that afternoon had been at a complete standstill for nearly 20 minutes after a semi-truck broke down at a major intersection. She had tried to find an alternate route, but every street leading into downtown Chicago was just as gridlocked. A thin layer of sweat slicked the back of her neck, despite the air conditioning blasting cold air. It wasn't the heat. It was the knowledge that her husband had zero tolerance for lateness. She glanced at the clock again. 6:29 p.m. The gathering wasn't an official company event, just a casual reception at an upscale bistro where Michael often entertained clients. But for her husband, anything involving his colleagues was a stage. He loved to be at the center of the table, his laughter the loudest, his voice commanding the conversation, showing everyone that he was a man in control, successful, and always on time. And tonight, Clara was supposed to pick him up after the event so they could drive home together. "Be there at 6:30 sharp," he had said that morning, not even looking at her, as if giving an order to an assistant. Clara's car finally pulled into the bistro's valet parking at 6:33 p.m. 3 minutes. Only 3 minutes. She killed the engine and stared at the large glass doors of the restaurant. From outside, she could see the silhouettes of people sitting at a long table near the window. The warm, amber lighting cast them in a golden glow. She recognized her husband instantly, even from a distance. His upright posture, the perfectly tailored gray suit, the animated gestures of his hands as he spoke. Clara wiped her damp palms on her midi skirt. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. A clean face with minimal makeup, hair tied back neatly, a simple silk blouse. She never liked to draw attention to herself. Michael had once told her, "You don't need to be the center of attention. Just stand by my side." She opened the car door and walked quickly toward the entrance. As soon as she stepped inside, the buzz of conversation and the clinking of glasses greeted her. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of warm food. A hostess greeted her, but Clara just gave a small nod, her eyes fixed on the long table in the corner. Her husband saw her first. The expression on his face shifted in a fraction of a second. The broad smile he had been showing his colleagues slowly vanished, replaced by a hard line in his jaw. He glanced at his watch with a deliberately theatrical motion. "Ah, finally," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. Several heads turned in Clara's direction. Some offered polite smiles. Others just gave her a fleeting glance. Clara walked closer, dipping her head slightly as a greeting. "I'm sorry, the traffic was." 3 minutes late, her husband cut her off, his voice flat but sharp. "I said 6:30. Clara swallowed hard. It was bad. A truck. Her husband let out a short laugh. Not a warm laugh, but one that sounded like a quiet jeer. There's always an excuse. The atmosphere at the table grew awkward. A man with glasses at the end of the table cleared his throat, trying to deflect the attention by raising his coffee cup. "Oh, it's no problem. We were just wrapping up," he said. But Michael didn't take his eyes off Clara. He stood up slowly from his chair, picking up his coffee cup, from which a thin wisp of steam still rose. Clara didn't immediately realize what was about to happen. She thought he was going to hand her the cup or perhaps just stand to introduce her. "Here," he said, staring straight at Clara. "Do you know why I hate tardiness?" Clara was silent. She could feel every eye at the table now fixed on them. "Because it makes people think I'm not respected." The sentence hung in the air for a few seconds. Then, without any warning, without any change in his tone, her husband lifted the cup and threw its contents in her face. It all happened so fast. The hot liquid hit her cheek, forehead, and ran down her chin and neck. The searing heat felt like 1,000 needles pricking her skin all at once. Clara stumbled half a step back. A few drops splashed onto her cream blouse, leaving a spreading brown stain. There was a small gasp from one of the women at the table. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone half stood, but no one actually approached. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her body froze, not because it didn't hurt, but because her mind seemed to detach from her body. She heard the voices around her as if from a great distance. "Oh my God, what are you doing? Michael, stop." Her husband was still standing in front of her, the empty cup in his hand, his breathing shallow. "That's a reminder," he said softly, but clearly. "So you learn to respect time." The words landed like a hammer blow. Clara slowly raised a hand to her face. Her skin stung, but it wasn't blistering. The coffee was hot, but not boiling. It was as if, even in his rage, her husband had calculated the temperature to avoid leaving any permanent marks. She looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no tears, just something quiet, deep, and empty. A few people finally moved closer. A waiter brought napkins and a glass of cold water. "Ma'am, here," he said nervously. Clara took the napkin and gently dabbed her face. Coffee dripped onto the marble floor, leaving a puddle that another waiter quickly cleaned up. The bitter smell was overpowering. "All right, let's go home," her husband said, his tone back to normal, almost casual. He placed the empty cup on the table and smoothed his suit jacket, as if he had just dropped a spoon. No one stopped him. No one called security. His colleagues just exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of where to stand. Michael's reputation was too big, his position too high. No one wanted to get involved. Clara stood tall. She didn't apologize again. She said nothing. She turned and walked out of the bistro with steady steps, even though every brush of the cool night air against her skin felt like a new sting. Outside, the sounds of the city returned. Honking cars, roaring engines, and the chatter of people on the sidewalk, all proceeding as if nothing had happened. No one knew that inside that bistro, something had irrevocably shattered. Her husband followed a few seconds later. "You were out of line," he said, his voice low but sharp as they neared the car, "forcing me to do that in front of everyone." Clara opened the car door without responding. "You know how important my image is. They need to know I won't be trifled with." Clara sat in the driver's seat, her hands back on the steering wheel. The same position as half an hour ago, only now there was a coffee stain on her blouse and a burning sensation on her skin. Her husband got into the passenger seat, letting out a long sigh. "Don't let it happen again." The engine started. The drive home was silent. The city lights streaked across the windshield, reflecting on Clara's pale face. From the outside, she appeared calm. No sobs, no complaints. But inside her, something that had been finely cracked for years had finally split wide open. She remembered the small moments she had once ignored, the raised voice, the condescending glances, the commands that could never be refused. She had always dismissed them as part of her husband's demanding nature. She had convinced herself that all successful men were intense, that she just needed to be more patient. But the hot coffee on her face wasn't just a momentary flash of anger. It was a declaration that she could be humiliated, that she could be made an example of, that her pain was less important than a man's image. Clara stopped the car at a red light. Her reflection was a faint outline on the windshield. There was a red blotch on her cheek, but it wasn't too obvious. It would probably fade by tomorrow. But something in her eyes had changed. It wasn't explosive rage, nor was it fragile sadness. It was awareness. The light turned green. The car moved forward. In the seat next to her husband had his phone out, probably already texting his colleagues, smoothing over the narrative of what had just happened. He seemed calm, confident that everything was back under his control. He had no idea that the 3-minute delay wasn't the biggest mistake of the evening. His biggest mistake was assuming Clara would remain silent, as always. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't fight back. But in her silence, a decision, still unformed, began to grow. And that decision would one day be far hotter than the coffee that had just touched her face. That night, their house felt the same as always. Quiet, immaculate, and nearly silent. The soft light in the living room cast shadows from the expensive furniture that always impressed their guests. Nothing had changed about the pristine white walls, the large gray sofa, or the display shelf filled with photos from their trips abroad. It all looked like a perfect life, but Clara knew something had shifted. As soon as the front door closed, Her husband walked straight to the bedroom without a backward glance. "Don't be so dramatic," he said curtly before disappearing behind the door, as if the incident at the bistro was a minor inconvenience not worth discussing. Clara stood in the living room for a few moments, listening to his footsteps fade. Then she walked slowly to the bathroom. The bright vanity lights felt too harsh on her still stinging skin. Clara stood before the mirror and looked at her reflection. A faint redness was visible on her right cheek and chin. Her hair was still slightly sticky from the coffee residue the napkin hadn't completely wiped away. The brown stain on her blouse had now dried into a stiff patch. She turned on the faucet and splashed her face with cold water. The touch of the water made her skin throb more distinctly, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the sensation that had settled in her chest, something heavy, like a stone pressing from the inside. Clara dried her face with a small towel and looked in the mirror again. For years, she had seen herself as a good enough wife. She didn't demand much, didn't protest often. She woke up early to make breakfast, ensured her husband's shirts were perfectly ironed, and managed the household with discipline. She believed that tranquility was the key to a marriage, that a patient woman kept a home intact. But that night, for the first time, she saw something different in her own eyes. It wasn't just hurt, it was a question. When had she started justifying things that should never have been justified? She sat on the edge of the bed after changing her clothes. Her husband was already lying down, his back to her, his breathing even, as if there was nothing left to think about. Clara stared at the plain white ceiling. Small memories began to surface, one by one, like shards of glass that had been hidden under a rug. She remembered the first night after they moved into this house. Her husband had been furious because she had misplaced an important document. He had slammed a folder on the table and said, "Don't you ever take me seriously? I could lose a major project because of your carelessness." The document had only been mixed in with other papers and was found 5 minutes later. At the time, Clara had just lowered her head and apologized, feeling that she should have been more careful. She remembered how her husband took over all their finances in their second year of marriage. "Let me handle it. You're too soft when it comes to money," he'd said. At first, it sounded like he was protecting her, but slowly Clara no longer knew how much they had in savings, what her husband's net income was, or even their monthly expenses. If she wanted to buy something outside of basic necessities, she had to ask. And every request was met with questions. What for? Is it really necessary? She remembered how her husband had forbidden her from going back to work after she resigned from her old job. "I don't need a wife with a career. I need a wife who supports mine," he had said firmly. Clara had nodded then, believing his decision was a form of trust. All those incidents had seemed small at the time. There were no slaps, no punches, just harsh words, a dismissive tone, and rules that slowly built a cage around her. And tonight, the hot coffee was the point she could no longer call a small thing. Clara closed her eyes. She tried to find a single reason to justify her husband's actions. Maybe she really was wrong to be late. Maybe she should have left earlier. Maybe she was insensitive to the pressures of his job. But the more she searched for a justification, the clearer one thing became. There was no reason great enough to humiliate someone in public, especially the person who shared his life. Clara opened her eyes. She glanced at her husband, who was still turned away from her. His back once felt like a shield. Now, it looked like a wall. She got up quietly and went back to the bathroom, this time with her phone. She stood in front of the mirror again and turned on the front-facing camera. She examined her face through the screen, zooming in on the reddened part of her cheek. She didn't intend to send the photo to anyone. She just wanted to confirm that what happened wasn't a figment of her imagination. The camera didn't lie. The red mark was real. She turned off the camera and, without thinking, opened her old photo gallery. Pictures from their travels appeared. Wide smiles on a beach, lavish dinners, a wedding anniversary with candles and flowers. In every photo, Clara was smiling softly beside her husband, who stood tall and full of confidence. Not a single photo captured the sound of shouting behind closed doors. None of them recorded the phrase, "Don't make me look bad," that she heard so often. The bathroom mirror reflected the image of a woman starting to see her life from a different angle. All this time, she had thought her husband was harsh because he wanted to be successful. that his anger was a form of ambition, that his control was a form of responsibility. But now she was beginning to realize something more disturbing. It wasn't about success. It was about power, about ensuring he was always on top, about ensuring Clara remained small. She lowered her phone and stared into her own eyes for a long time. There were fine lines around the corners she had never noticed before, not from age, but from holding back too often. Clara replayed the moment in the bistro, the way her husband had looked at her before throwing the coffee. There was no hesitation, no regret, only the conviction that he had the right to do it. That conviction was what hurt the most. She left the bathroom and sat at the small vanity table near the window. A cool night breeze slipped through a crack in the curtains. She took a deep breath. For the first time, she didn't feel like crying. She felt angry. Not an explosive anger, but a calm, clear anger. An anger that focused her mind instead of clouding it. She realized that tonight's incident wasn't the beginning of something bad. It was the culmination of something that had been growing for a long time. A pattern she had allowed because she was too convinced that love meant enduring. Clara stood up and walked to the small home office in the corner of the house. The space had been rarely used since she stopped working. The polished wooden desk was still tidy. A few old documents were stored in a drawer. She sat in the chair and opened the top drawer. There were several folders containing copies of household documents she had filed away before her husband took over everything. She didn't know why she had kept them. Maybe it was an old habit from her days as a meticulous administrative assistant. She closed the drawer. Tonight was not the night for action. She didn't know what she was going to do yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She no longer saw her marriage as something whole and unshakable. There was a crack, and that crack wasn't caused by a 3-minute delay. The crack had been there for a long time. She had only just found the courage to look at it now. Clara returned to the bedroom. She lay on her side of the bed, maintaining a small distance from her husband's body. The space between them felt wider than ever. She closed her eyes, but her mind remained awake. If she had always endured for the sake of reputation, for the sake of the home, for the sake of her husband's image, then tonight she realized something more important. No image was worth paying for with one's dignity. And in the silence of that room, while her husband slept without a care, Clara began to understand that the most dangerous thing wasn't the hot coffee on her face, but the habit of accepting treatment that diminished her. That realization didn't come with a loud crash. It arrived slowly, like a thin sliver of light piercing through the curtains. And once that light appeared, Clara knew she could never go back to being the same woman she was yesterday. The morning arrived as usual, with no sign that anything inside the house had changed. The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. Clara opened her eyes before the second beep. She didn't feel tired. Despite barely sleeping, a strange calm had settled in her chest. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of a decision beginning to solidify. She rose quietly from the bed so as not to wake her husband. He was still sound asleep, his face serene, as if the world always bent to his will. Clara looked at him for a few seconds. She used to gaze at that face with warmth, feeling lucky to have a husband considered so successful and respected. This morning, she only saw a man who was utterly convinced that everyone around him would stay, no matter what he did. Clara went to the bathroom and washed her face. The redness on her cheek had started to fade, leaving only a faint discoloration that was almost invisible. If you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't notice. The physical wound was never the biggest problem. She went down to the kitchen and started preparing breakfast, just like always. Scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee with no sugar, her husband's favorite. Her movements were methodical, not rushed, not trembling. The knife sliced the bread with precision. The spatula stirred the eggs in the pan with a steady rhythm. In her head, there was no panic, no frantic thought of what should I do. There was only a clear line of thought, like someone beginning to draw a map. Her husband came downstairs around 6:20 a.m., already dressed in a crisp white shirt and a navy blue tie. He sat at the dining table without a word of greeting. Clara placed a plate in front of him and a steaming cup of coffee. A few seconds passed in silence. "Does your face still hurt?" he finally asked, his tone flat. It sounded more like a perfunctory question than genuine concern. "It's fine now," she replied calmly. Her husband gave a small nod. You know why I did that? Clara didn't answer right away. She sat across from him, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. Because I was 3 minutes late, she said softly. Because you made me look disrespected. People need to know I don't tolerate indiscipline. Normally, at this point, Clara would have apologized again. She would have said she understood, that she would be more careful. But that morning, she just nodded slightly. I understand, she said. Her answer seemed to make her husband relax a little. He sipped his coffee, feeling the conversation was over. For him, the situation was back under control. Clara hadn't cried, hadn't argued, hadn't dragged out the issue, just like always. What he failed to notice, however, was a small, invisible change. Clara no longer felt the need to defend herself. After breakfast, Clara picked up her purse and stood up. I'll walk you to the car, she said. Her husband raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised. You don't have to. I usually go by myself. It's okay. They walked side by side to the garage. The morning air was still cool, the sun not yet high in the sky. Clara opened the door to her husband's car and stood beside it. He looked at her for a moment, as if searching for something in her face held back tears, anger, or maybe a remnant of fear. But all he found was serenity. Don't do it again, he said before getting into the car. Clara gave a faint smile. I won't. The car backed out of the garage and disappeared around the corner. Clara stood there for a few seconds longer, watching the now empty street. She went back inside and closed the door softly. The house suddenly felt more spacious without his presence. She walked to the living room, sat on the sofa, and took out her phone. One name had been on her mind since last night. Jessica, an old friend from her former office. A woman who, a few years ago, had said to her in a serious tone, Clara, are you sure you're happy? I see the way he treats you. At the time, Clara had smiled and replied that Jessica was being too sensitive, that her husband was just assertive. After Clara quit her job, their friendship had cooled. Not because of a fight, but because of a distance she had deliberately created. Her husband had once said, Your friends don't understand our life. They could be a bad influence. And Clara, again, had complied. She opened her old contacts and found the name still saved. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a few seconds. This wasn't about venting. This was about opening a door she had once closed herself. Clara typed a short message. Jessica, do you have time today? I'd like to meet. She stared at the screen for a moment before hitting send. A few minutes later, a reply came in. Of course. Are you okay? Clara looked at the question. She didn't answer directly. She typed, deleted, and typed again. I need to talk. The response was quick. Lunch? The cafe near our old office. Clara read the message and took a deep breath. After that brief exchange, she put her phone on the table. Her heart wasn't pounding like someone about to do something wrong. Instead, she felt lighter. That day, for the first time in a long time, Clara chose to do something without asking for permission. She walked to the small home office in the corner. The wooden desk was the same as last night. She sat down and opened the laptop that had been dormant for so long. The screen slowly came to life, revealing old documents she had once saved. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew she could no longer just wait. For years, every time her husband got angry, Clara had reacted with emotion, crying in secret, feeling guilty, trying to fix herself. This time was different. She didn't want to prove she was a good wife. She wanted to ensure she would no longer be a target. Around noon, Clara got ready to leave the house. She chose simple but neat clothes, a blouse and a black skirt. She stood in front of the mirror one last time. The red mark was almost gone. Good, she murmured softly. She locked the door and stepped outside. The drive to the cafe felt different from the night before. There was no fear of being scolded for being late, no barrage of texts demanding an explanation. She drove calmly. When she arrived and saw Jessica already sitting and waiting for her, a strange feeling emerged, a mix of nostalgia and tension. Jessica stood up as soon as she saw Clara. She greeted her warmly, and Clara sat down across from her. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other without a word. You look different, Jessica said carefully. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe I am. Jessica studied her face more closely. What happened? Clara didn't answer right away. She stirred her drink slowly. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed to talk about something she had hidden for so long. He threw hot coffee in my face yesterday, she said calmly. Jessica was silent. What? Because I was 3 minutes late. The silence that followed the statement was heavy, but not suffocating. Clara's voice didn't tremble as she spoke. She didn't cry. Jessica let out a long sigh, her eyes flashing with an anger she didn't try to hide. Clara, this isn't the first time, is it? The question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Clara shook her head slowly. No. She began to recount the things she had kept to herself for so long, the yelling, the financial control, being forbidden to work, the way her husband always made sure she felt small. Clara spoke without excessive emotion, like someone compiling a report. Jessica listened without interrupting. I don't want to cry anymore, Clara said finally. I want to think. Jessica took her hand. What do you want to do? Clara looked at their clasped hands. She didn't have a complete answer yet, but one thing was certain. I'm not going to fight back with anger. I'm going to fight back in a way he'll never see coming. Jessica nodded slowly. Inside Clara, a strategy began to form. She knew her husband feared losing his image above all else, feared looking weak, and for the first time, Clara understood that strength doesn't always come from a loud voice. Sometimes, strength comes from calculated silence. That day, Clara returned home with a firmer step. She no longer felt like a confused victim. She felt like someone who had just opened her eyes. And behind her still calm face, a choice had been made. The next day, she didn't cry. She began to move. And behind her still calm face, a choice had been made. The next morning, Clara woke up with a different feeling than on previous days. It wasn't because of the mark on her face, the redness was almost completely gone, but because her mind was now moving with a clear direction. She was no longer drifting along a current set by someone else. She was charting her own course. Her husband left early that day for an important meeting with the board. He looked as confident as ever. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes gleamed, and his face showed no trace of the incident at the bistro. Before leaving, he simply said, I might be home late. There was no discussion about the day before, no apology, as if it was all over. Clara nodded, just as she always did. But after the front door closed and the sound of her husband's car faded, Clara didn't go back to the kitchen or her small office. She stood for a moment in the living room, looking at the wall where their wedding photo hung. In the picture, she was smiling broadly, holding the hand of the man who was now the center of her life. Or at least, she used to think so. Today, she decided to see her husband's world up close. For years, his office was just a story, a place he always mentioned with a tone of pride, as if that was where his achievements and dignity were built. Clara rarely went there, only occasionally attending formal events or holiday parties. Otherwise, she was always on the outside, hearing his stories but never truly understanding how his world worked. She chose a simple light gray suit, her hair in a neat bun, and comfortable flat shoes. Her appearance was clean, calm, and inconspicuous. She wanted to enter not as an angry wife, but as someone to be taken seriously. The drive to the office building felt different from previous trips. The tall, glass-encased skyscraper stood proudly in the heart of the business district, reflecting the morning sun like a statement of power. The company logo was displayed prominently on the facade, a symbol of a hard-earned reputation. Clara parked her car in the guest area and walked toward the main entrance. As the automatic glass doors slid open, the cool air of the building's climate control washed over her. The polished marble floors, the black reception desk, and the clean scent of the space created an impression of controlled professionalism. People in formal attire hurried past, carrying folders and tablets, speaking in low, quick tones. She approached the reception desk. "Good morning," the female receptionist greeted with a standard smile. "Good morning," Clara replied calmly. "I'm Clara." She said her husband's last name without hesitation. The receptionist seemed to recognize the name. Her smile became slightly more formal. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" "No, but I'm his wife." The words came out without any extra emotion, just a fact. The receptionist nodded quickly. "Please wait a moment, ma'am." Clara stood near the waiting area sofa, observing her surroundings. A few employees glanced at her. Some recognized her face from company events. Some offered polite smiles. Others looked awkward. She noticed something subtle but clear. A palpable tension accompanied the mention of her husband's name, like an invisible ripple that was nonetheless felt. Soon, a young man from the administrative division approached her. "Mrs. Collins, please follow me. I'll take you to Mr. Collins' office." Clara followed him down a long corridor lined with glass-walled offices. In each room, she saw people working with serious expressions. Some were hunched over their computer screens. Others were in quiet discussions with cautious looks. As they passed one of the conference rooms, she caught a snippet of a conversation. "Michael won't like a report that looks like this." The voice was anxious. She noted it silently. She was starting to see the pattern. In this place, her husband wasn't just a manager. He was the center of control, the source of approval, and also of fear. Her husband's office was at the end of the corridor, with a large wooden door and frosted glass at the top. The young man knocked softly. "Come in," came her husband's voice from inside. When the door opened and Clara stepped in, her husband's face changed instantly. He clearly hadn't expected to see her there. "Clara," he said, standing up from his chair. "What is it?" Clara smiled faintly. "I just wanted to stop by. It's been a while." Her husband glanced at the staff member who had escorted her, then gestured for the door to be closed. Once they were alone, his tone dropped slightly. "You didn't tell me you were coming. I didn't think it would be a problem. I wanted to see where you work." Her husband stared at her for a few seconds, trying to read some hidden motive. But Clara gave nothing away. Her face remained gentle, her demeanor polite. "All right," he said finally, sitting back down. "It's just an ordinary office." Clara walked slowly around the room. A large, dark wood desk, a bookshelf filled with documents, and a massive window overlooking the city. Everything was impeccably organized. On the wall hung several awards and a photo with the board of directors. Image. She could see how important all of this was to her husband. Every detail was designed to project professionalism and success. "Everyone seems so busy," Clara remarked lightly. "Of course. A company this size can't afford to be relaxed." His voice had regained its authoritative tone. In this room, he was the ruler. Clara sat in the guest chair in front of his desk. "You must have a solid team. Solid because they're disciplined," he replied curtly. That word echoed in Clara's mind again. Discipline, a word he always used to justify pressure. After a few minutes of light conversation, Clara stood up. "I don't want to disturb you. I just wanted to see the place." Her husband seemed slightly relieved. "Fine. Just let me know next time." Clara nodded and left the office with a calm stride. However, she didn't head straight for the elevator. She walked slowly down the corridor, observing the expressions of the people she passed. There were polite smiles, but also gazes that were quickly averted. Near the copy room, she saw a young woman lower her head when she heard her footsteps. When Clara offered a small smile, the woman returned it with a hesitant one. "Good morning, ma'am," she said softly. "Morning," Clara replied. There was something in the woman's tone, a mixture of respect and wariness. Clara was beginning to understand that the battlefield wasn't their home. The real battlefield was here, in this gleaming office tower, in these glass-walled rooms that reflected an image of perfection. Her husband might feel invincible here, but it was precisely here that he was most dependent on his reputation. If home was his private domain where he could control everything, the office was a public stage. Here, the opinions of others determined his position. Clara stood in front of a large window near the elevators and looked out at the city below. The cars looked tiny, the people like moving dots. She felt something she had never realized before. Clarity. She wouldn't attack him with emotion. She would understand his structure. She would learn who was afraid, who was silent, and who might be tired of it all. The elevator doors opened. Clara stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, she saw her reflection on the polished steel wall. Her face was calm. There were no visible scars, no sign that she had been publicly humiliated just a few days ago. But behind that calm, she now saw the bigger picture. Her husband stood strong not because he was untouchable, but because no one dared to touch him. And for the first time, Clara was no longer standing outside that building as a spectator. She had stepped inside. She had seen his stage, and in her silence, she began to understand that the lesson she was about to teach didn't need to be shouted. It just needed to be aimed correctly. Returning from her husband's office didn't bring immediate satisfaction. Instead, the visit opened up more questions than answers. She had seen the downcast faces, heard the conversations that stopped when her husband's name was mentioned, and felt the subtle tension that professionalism couldn't entirely hide. If she had only ever felt her husband's control at home, she now realized that control extended much further. That night, after her husband came home late and went straight to bed with few words, Clara stayed awake in her small home office. The desk lamp cast a dim, warm circle of light on the wooden surface. The desk drawers she had only briefly touched the night before were now opened one by one. For years, Clara had managed many of the household's administrative tasks. She had kept copies of the mortgage agreement, insurance policies, personal tax returns, and even investment documents they had once discussed together before he took over everything. Her habits were neat and systematic. She always made backup copies, storing them in labeled folders with small, handwritten tags. She pulled out a dark blue folder from the bottom drawer. The label was simple: Finances, 3 years ago. She opened it slowly. A few pages of a corporate financial report were neatly folded inside. Clara frowned. She remembered printing them at her husband's request when the office printer was broken and he had asked for her help from home. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention to the contents. She had just printed, signed for receipt, and kept a copy out of habit, her habit of saving anything that felt important. Now, she read it carefully. The numbers that once seemed like a string of foreign symbols began to form a pattern. She wasn't an accounting expert, but her years of experience in administration had made her sensitive to inconsistencies. There was an expense column that had spiked drastically in one quarter without a detailed explanation. There was an electronic signature that looked hastily placed, and most disturbingly, there was a small note in the corner of the page, adjusted per manager's directive. The manager was her husband. Clara took a slow breath. She opened another folder. External projects. Inside was a copy of a partnership agreement with a specific vendor. The vendor's name was familiar. She had heard her husband mention them with a cynical tone, saying they weren't competent enough. Yet, the contract showed a large partnership value, far above the average for similar projects. She read more closely. There was an additional clause that unfairly benefited his company and imposed heavy penalties on the vendor if certain targets weren't met. Targets that, based on an internal report in the other folder, seemed to have been deliberately made difficult. The pieces started to connect. Manipulated reports to cover up pressure on business partners, adjusted figures to maintain an appearance of stability, and all of it leading back to the same signature. Clara sat up straight, her heart beating faster, not from fear, but from a sharpening awareness. This wasn't just a harsh attitude toward subordinates, this was abuse of power. She recalled the brief conversation in the office corridor, the employee's voice saying, "Michael won't like a report that looks like this." That sentence now carried a different meaning. Maybe it wasn't just about the quality of the work. Maybe it was about the numbers not fitting the desired narrative. Clara stood up and walked to the small filing cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside was a box containing old flash drives, personal notes, and a few documents she had once deemed unimportant. She opened one box and found a black flash drive that hadn't been used in a long time. A faint memory surfaced. A few years ago, her husband had asked her to back up some project data because the office system was having issues. "Just save it for now. I'll get it later," he had said, but he never asked for it back. Clara turned on her laptop and inserted the flash drive. It took a few seconds for the folders to appear on the screen. She opened them one by one. Inside were spreadsheet files, copied emails, and draft reports before their final revisions. Clara compared one of the drafts with the printed report from the blue folder. The difference was stark. In the draft, the project's losses were recorded as quite substantial. In the final report, that number was much smaller, almost insignificant. Several explanatory lines had been deleted. There was an email from a staff member questioning the change, and a brief reply from her husband. "Follow the instructions. Don't complicate this." The phrase felt like an echo from their own home. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't surprised that her husband could pressure others. She had experienced it herself. But seeing concrete proof that the pressure extended to data manipulation elevated everything to a different level. The stakes were no longer just about her dignity, but about his professional reputation, and possibly the law. She opened another email in the folder, a conversation with the head of the finance department. The tone of the email was cautious. One sentence read, "I'm concerned this could become an issue if we're audited." Her husband's reply was brief. "Internal audits can be managed." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The hot coffee that had once touched her face now seemed like a small symbol compared to what she held in her hands. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the laptop screen. For so long, she had thought her husband was obsessed with his image because he wanted to appear strong. Now she realized that image might not just be about pride, it was a shield to cover up things that must never be revealed. Clara went back to the files and moved copies of the important documents to a separate folder on her laptop. She wasn't rushed. She made sure every relevant document was saved neatly, named clearly, and backed up elsewhere. She didn't know if all this was enough to bring someone down, but she knew it was enough to shake the foundations. The sound of the bedroom door opening made her turn. Her husband was standing in the doorway of the office, his face tired but wary. "You're not in bed yet?" he asked. "In a bit," Clara replied calmly, partially closing the laptop screen. Her husband glanced at the desk, at the open folders. "What are you doing?" "Just organizing some old documents, so they're not a mess." Her husband nodded briefly. "Don't be too late." He returned to the bedroom without suspicion. Clara waited until his footsteps faded, then looked back at the screen. That folder contained more than just numbers. It held proof of pressure, instructions that violated ethics, and deliberate data alterations. She realized something significant. If she had just gone to the office and screamed about the hot coffee, people might have dismissed it as a domestic dispute. But if she came with these documents, the narrative changed. It was no longer about feelings. It was about integrity. Clara shut down the laptop slowly. She sat in the silence, letting her mind absorb the consequences of what she had just found. If she took this further, there was no turning back. She wasn't just risking her marriage, but her husband's public reputation, maybe even his career. But then she remembered her husband's look as he threw the coffee. That unwavering conviction that he had the right to do whatever he wanted. That conviction now had an opponent. Clara stood up and locked the drawer where the folders were stored. She put the flash drive in a separate place, no longer in the old box, but in her personal handbag. She walked to the bedroom and lay down on her side of the bed. Her husband was already asleep, his breathing heavy. Clara stared at the ceiling in the darkness. She was holding something far hotter than the liquid that had once touched her skin. Something that could burn not a face, but the foundation he had so carefully built. And for the first time since their marriage began, Clara didn't feel small. She felt dangerous, and for the first time since the hot coffee touched her face, Clara felt she held control over the fire that had been burning her from the inside. That sense of control didn't erupt like a victory. It crept in slowly, like the morning air seeping through a window crack. Clara sat in her living room, staring at the files she had neatly arranged on the coffee table. Financial documents, copied emails, records of company expenses she had never understood before. They now formed a clear pattern, but what disturbed her more than the numbers were the faces behind them. She remembered the times she had seen her husband, Michael, speaking on the phone in a low, sharp tone. The way he mentioned his subordinates' names mockingly, the little laugh he gave when someone begged for a deadline extension. Clara used to think it was just a tough leadership style. Now she knew it was practiced intimidation. The next day, Clara decided to return to Michael's office. Not to confront him, nor to reveal all her cards. She went to listen. She wore a simple but professional outfit, similar to her previous visit. Her face was no longer red. The physical mark had almost vanished. All that remained was a silence that felt denser than before. In the office lobby, a few employees recognized her. They greeted her with polite smiles that faded too quickly. There was an unspoken tension, as if her presence cast a shadow no one wanted to touch. Clara requested a meeting with a junior administrative staff member, A young woman named Ashley, whom she had seen leaving Michael's office with puffy eyes a few times. Clara didn't approach her as the director's wife. She came as someone seeking to understand. Ashley looked nervous as they sat in a small break room near the pantry. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. "Is there something I can help you with, ma'am?" she asked softly. Clara looked at her gently. "I'm not here as Mr. Collins's wife," she said calmly. "I just wanted to ask, do you feel safe working here?" The question was simple, but its impact was not. Ashley was silent for a long time, her eyes blinking rapidly, as if trying to hold back something that had been locked away. "Safe? What do you mean, ma'am? Have you ever felt pressured to do something that wasn't by the book? Or felt afraid to say no?" The word afraid made Ashley's shoulders slump slightly. "There are targets we have to meet," she answered cautiously. "Sometimes, if a report isn't to his liking, we're asked to change the numbers. Not to invent them, but to adjust them." "Adjust them for whom?" Clara asked, her voice still calm. Ashley didn't answer directly. She just looked down, and in that silence, Clara got the answer she needed. She didn't press further. She didn't ask for a written confession. She simply said, "If you ever need a place to talk, you can call me." She wrote her phone number on a small piece of paper and gently pushed it toward Ashley. As Clara stood to leave, she felt a change. She used to feel small in Michael's work environment, like a silent, trailing shadow. That day, she walked with a steady gait. She was no longer there to pick him up or to wait. She was there to see. And what she saw wasn't just violence in her own home, but a much broader pattern. Over the next few days, short messages started coming to her phone, not just from Ashley, but from two other names she didn't recognize. They didn't tell long stories, just brief sentences. "Ma'am, is it true you know about last quarter's report? Ma'am, did you ever see the documents for the project that was suddenly canceled?" Clara read each message carefully. She never replied with emotion. She only asked for facts, dates, names, small details. One by one, the pieces of the story began to assemble. A finance staffer confessed to being asked to sign off on approvals he didn't fully understand. A project manager was forced to take the fall for a failure that was actually Michael's decision. Every story had the same undertone: fear cloaked in professionalism. Clara realized that Michael wasn't just a cruel husband at home. He was a leader who built his power on the submission of others. She didn't feel triumphant. There was no sweet taste of revenge. Instead, there was a deep sadness. How long had she lived beside someone who used fear as a tool? One afternoon, one of Michael's subordinates, a middle-aged man named David, asked to meet in person. They chose a small coffee shop far from the office. David looked tired. His hair was starting to gray, his face etched with deep lines. "I've worked at that company for 20 years, he said softly. "Before Mr. Collins was promoted, the atmosphere was different. Now, everyone just thinks about how to avoid being the next target." "Target?" Clara repeated. His anger, his pressure. "If you make a small mistake, you're humiliated in a meeting. If a project fails, you're forced to take all the blame." Clara was silent. The word humiliated echoed in her head, bringing back the memory of hot coffee and the stares of strangers in the bistro. "Why didn't anyone report it?" she asked softly. David gave a bitter smile. "Who would believe it? The company's results look good. Targets are met, and he's brilliant at maintaining his image." Image. The word reaffirmed what Clara had understood since she first stood in that office lobby. Michael lived and died by his reputation. Without it, he was fragile. The conversation that afternoon wasn't about inciting a rebellion. Clara never told them they should fight back. She just listened, creating a space for their stories to emerge from the darkness. And in the process of listening, she changed. She no longer saw herself as a lone victim, shamed for being 3 minutes late. She saw a wider network of injustice that had been hidden behind tailored suits and professional smiles. That night, when Michael came home, he seemed normal. He talked about meetings, clients, and the difficulty of managing an incompetent team. Clara looked at him. For the first time, she saw that statement not as a principle, but as a justification. "And what if that pressure breaks people?" she asked gently. Michael raised an eyebrow. "If they're not strong enough, they get weeded out." The answer was simple, cold, and without hesitation. Inside Clara, something hardened. Not an explosive anger, but a resolute determination. She no longer wanted to just teach him a personal lesson. She wanted to stop the pattern that kept so many people silent. A few days later, another message from Ashley arrived. This one was longer. She had forwarded a copy of an internal email showing instructions to change figures before a report was sent to the board of directors. Clara stared at her phone screen for a long time. The fire that had once burned her face had now transformed into something else. Not pain, but power. She knew the next step would be risky. She knew Michael wouldn't stay silent if he realized this shift. But she also knew that staying silent meant letting more people get burned without a sound. And Clara was no longer willing to be part of that silence. She was no longer the obedient wife. She was no longer the woman who apologized for being 3 minutes late. She was someone who had started to open a door for others' courage. And once that door was open, the winds of change would not be easily shut. That morning, the winds of change blew colder than usual. Clara stood before her bedroom mirror, looking at her reflection with a calm that felt both foreign and familiar. Gone was the shocked, confused face from the day the hot coffee hit her skin. Gone was the woman who searched for fault in herself. All that remained was someone who had carefully calculated her every step. On her vanity table lay a neat brown folder. Inside were copies of internal emails, financial reports with crossed-out and replaced figures, and a systematically arranged timeline of events. She wasn't bringing all the evidence, just enough to open a much larger door. The meeting invitation had been sent 2 days earlier under the subject line, Administrative Clarification Regarding Last Quarter's Financial Documentation. Clara didn't use her husband's name in the subject line, nor did she mention her personal relationship with the CEO. She signed the invitation with her own name, nothing more. To her surprise, management responded quickly. The secretary to the Board of Commissioners even scheduled it for that morning, before official business hours began. Michael knew none of the details. When he saw Clara dressed more professionally than usual, he just assumed she was attending a social event or meeting a friend. "Where are you off to so early?" he asked while tying his tie. "To the office," Clara replied simply. Michael chuckled. "The office? Picking me up again?" The line was delivered lightly, as if it were a joke, but it hung between them like the lingering scent of coffee that had never truly faded. Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Not to pick you up." Michael didn't ask further. He was too confident to feel threatened. The drive to the office felt different from her previous visits. Clara was no longer arriving as a trailing shadow. She walked through the main entrance with the folder in hand, wearing a simple blazer that gave her a professional air. The gazes of several employees followed her, this time not out of pity, but out of the whispers that had begun to circulate. She was directed straight to the third-floor conference room, a place usually reserved for top management. The room was spacious, with a long, dark wood table and tall, neatly arranged chairs. At the far end, a large window offered a view of a city still half awake. 3 people were already there: Mr. Henderson, the chairman of the board, Miss Davis from Internal Audit, and a corporate lawyer who was rarely seen. Michael had not yet arrived. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Collins," Mr. Henderson said, his tone formal but cautious. Clara nodded. "Thank you for making the time." She sat down without showing any nervousness. Her hands didn't tremble. Her heart beat with a steady rhythm, as if it had found its own pace. A few minutes later, the door opened. Michael walked in with a confident stride. His face showed a hint of confusion when he saw the room's attendees. "What's all this?" he asked, pulling out a chair. "An early morning meeting I wasn't told about?" Mr. Henderson cleared his throat softly. "There are some administrative clarifications we need to hear." Michael glanced at Clara. The look was quick, but sharp enough to convey his displeasure. Clara opened her folder calmly. "I wish to present some findings regarding the documentation of the last quarter's financial report. As someone who has assisted with personal archiving and document management at home, I've found copies that are inconsistent with the final version that was submitted." Michael gave a faint smile. "This is an internal company matter. Not everyone understands the context." Clara turned to him. "That's why I'm requesting an official clarification." She took out a single sheet of paper and pushed it to the center of the table. "Miss, Davis picked it up, read it quickly, and frowned. "This is the initial draft of Project A's report," Clara explained. "The figures are different from the final version that was sent." Michael leaned back in his chair. "Revisions are a normal part of the process. The audit team surely knows that." "True," Miss Davis chimed in softly. "But this change is quite significant." Clara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The tension in the room was thick enough. "I am not making accusations," she continued. "I simply want to ensure that all processes are conducted according to ethics and procedure. Because if they are not, the impact is not only on the company, but also on the employees who signed those reports." The word employees made Michael sit up a little straighter. "Who has been talking to you?" he asked sharply. Clara looked at him directly. "This isn't about who, it's about what." Mr. Henderson raised a hand, signaling for Michael to be calm. "Let's focus on the documents." The discussion went on longer than Clara had anticipated. Every page she produced raised new questions. There were no direct accusations, but there were enough gaps that couldn't be ignored. Michael began to lose his patience. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Every decision was made in the company's best interest. If adjustments were made, it was part of the strategy." "A strategy that involved pressuring staff?" Clara asked gently. The room fell silent. "Pressure is part of management," Michael retorted quickly. "Is humiliating subordinates in front of their peers also part of management?" Clara's voice remained flat. Mr. Henderson's expression changed. Miss Davis stopped taking notes. Michael stared at Clara as if looking at a stranger. "You've crossed a line." "Which line? The professional one or the personal one?" The question was devoid of emotion. Its calmness made it feel sharper. The lawyer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Perhaps we need to conduct an additional internal audit to ensure there have been no procedural violations." Michael laughed shortly. "Because of a report from my wife?" Clara did not smile. "Because of the facts on record." The ensuing silence was heavier. For the first time since the meeting began, Michael didn't have an immediate comeback. He realized something he had never considered. Clara hadn't come with anger. She had come with preparation. And in the world he had controlled with intimidation, preparation was a more dangerous weapon. The meeting concluded without a final decision, but with a commitment to conduct a thorough review. For Clara, that was enough for one day. She didn't want to destroy everything in one move. She wanted to ensure each step was built on solid ground. As everyone began to stand, Michael approached her. His face was controlled, but his jaw was tight. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Clara looked at him, an invisible but palpable distance between them. "Administrative clarification. You're embarrassing me." Clara paused for a moment, then said softly, "I'm just opening a document." Michael didn't reply. Outside the room, a few employees pretended to be busy, but their eyes were full of questions. Clara walked down the hallway without looking down. The small, suffocating feeling in her chest was gone. She hadn't yelled, hadn't accused. She had simply stood with the facts in her hand. And in that morning meeting, for the first time, Michael was not the most mentally powerful person in the room. Clara stepped out of the building and took a long breath. The city sky was fully bright. The streets were getting busy. As always, the world didn't stop for one meeting, but something had shifted. She knew this wasn't over. There would be a reaction, there would be a fight. But she also knew one thing for sure. She was no longer alone in her fear. She had changed the battlefield. And now, it was no longer about a 3-minute delay. It was about who dared to stand up when the truth was brought into the light. And that morning, that light could no longer be blocked by closed-door meetings or the professional smile that had always been Michael's shield. An invitation for a follow-up meeting was officially sent by the Board of Commissioners 3 days after the first one. This time, the subject was no longer administrative clarification, but internal evaluation and leadership review. The words sounded neutral, but everyone in the office knew which way the wind was blowing. Clara received a copy of the invitation in a personal email account she rarely checked. It listed the agenda: presentation of preliminary internal audit findings, response from the CEO, and additional statements from related parties. Related parties meant her. Michael no longer bothered to hide his anger at home. He didn't yell or slam things. His silence was sharper. He moved about as usual, dressing impeccably, speaking curtly, but his gaze toward Clara no longer held absolute confidence. Something there was cracked, something he tried to hide with arrogance. "You think this is going to end well for you?" he asked the night before the meeting. Clara closed the book she was reading. "I'm not thinking about the end. I'm thinking about the truth." Michael gave a thin smile, the kind that used to make people tremble. "The world doesn't run on truth alone," he replied softly. He didn't need to say more. The unsaid words were heavier. The next morning, the main conference room was filled with more people than usual. Besides the commissioners and the audit team, several division managers were also present. The atmosphere was no longer just formal. It was filled with curiosity, anxiety, and restrained hope. Clara entered without rushing. She carried the same folder, but this time it was thicker. Behind her, David sat with a serious expression. Ashley was in a back row, her hands clutching a notebook tightly. Michael was already seated at the head of the table. His suit was perfect, his hair neatly combed. To an outsider, it would look like just another routine meeting. Mr. Henderson opened the session with a measured voice. "Today, we will hear the preliminary results of the internal audit and give all parties an opportunity to respond." Miss Davis stood first. She presented the findings in professional language: significant discrepancies in figures on several project reports, instructions for revisions without official documentation, and a pattern of pressure on staff to sign altered documents. There was no use of the word fraud or gross misconduct, but terms like procedural inconsistencies and indications of abuse of authority were enough to make the room tense. Michael listened without changing his expression. When his turn came, he stood up calmly. "Every decision I made was for the stability of the company," he said. "In the business world, numerical flexibility is not uncommon. We did not manipulate. We adjusted to keep projections realistic." A few heads nodded uncertainly. He still commanded authority. His voice was steady, his language convincing. Leadership requires firmness. If some felt pressured, perhaps they weren't ready for high standards. That line would have once ended the discussion. People would have looked down, accepting his explanation as the sole truth. But that day was different. Mr. Henderson turned to Clara. "Mrs. Collins, if you please." Clara stood up slowly. There was no tremor in her hands. She didn't look at Michael first. She looked at the entire room. "I am not speaking as a wife," she said, her voice clear. "I am speaking as a witness to documents and stories that have been hidden for too long." She opened her folder and displayed a copy of the email obtained from Ashley. On the projector screen, the lines of revision instructions appeared clearly, complete with the date and time of delivery. This email shows a request to change figures before the report was submitted. There is no official record of the reason for this change. Michael immediately interjected. "Internal emails can be misinterpreted." That was part of a discussion. Clara nodded. "That's why I also brought this." She produced a second document, the initial version of a report with the finance staffer's signature, alongside the final version with different numbers and the same signature. Mr. Anderson from Finance signed the initial version. He stated he was never given an opportunity to review the final version before it was sent. A low murmur went through the room. A name was mentioned, a fact delivered. It was no longer abstract. Michael stared at Clara sharply. "This is slander." Clara turned to him for the first time since she had stood up. "If this is slander, let's examine it together." She didn't raise her voice. Her calmness made Michael's denial sound more emotional. Suddenly, David stood up from his chair. "I would like to speak." All eyes turned to him. He wasn't on the board. He was just a longtime manager who rarely spoke up. "I was once asked to take responsibility for a project failure when the initial decision was not mine," he said, his voice trembling slightly but firm. "I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing my job." The word "afraid" echoed in the room, like an old sound finally finding a wall to bounce off of. Ashley stood up too, though her body was shaking. "I received instructions to change numbers via email. I was afraid to refuse." Michael looked at them one by one, as if in disbelief. The face that once made everyone look down no longer held the same power. "This is a mutiny," he said coldly. "This is testimony," Clara replied softly. The peak of the confrontation wasn't shouting or a slammed table. It was quiet, heavy, and inevitable. Each piece of evidence presented was like a small crack in the pristine glass that had long protected Michael's image. The cracks didn't shatter it instantly, but they were enough to change how people saw through it. Mr. Henderson concluded the discussion with a temporary decision: the formation of an independent investigation team and a temporary suspension of certain authorities until the audit was complete. It wasn't a verdict, but for someone who lived by his reputation, it was an earthquake. Michael sat back down, his jaw hardening. The thin smile was gone. The untouchable aura had vanished. For the first time, he looked like an ordinary man losing his footing. The meeting ended without applause, without excessive drama. People filed out of the room with mixed expressions, relieved, anxious, but also standing a little taller than before. Clara remained standing for a few seconds after everyone had moved. She felt her breath steady. No burst of emotion, no tears. Michael approached her. "Are you satisfied?" Clara looked at him with a gaze that no longer sought approval. "This isn't about satisfaction. You've destroyed everything." Clara shook her head slowly. "I just turned on the lights." Michael didn't answer. He walked out without looking back. In the office hallway, some of the employees who had always avoided her gaze now stood with their shoulders straighter. They didn't cheer, they didn't clap, but there was a subtle, palpable change. They no longer looked down when Clara passed. The face of Michael, the face that had once been a symbol of fear, no longer held the same power. Clara stepped out of the building with a feeling that was hard to name. Not victory, not revenge. It was more like a liberation from a long-held illusion. She knew the legal and administrative processes were far from over. There would be further investigations, likely greater consequences. But what had been shattered that day wasn't just the professional image of a CEO. What was shattered was the system of silence that had nurtured fear. And in the midst of the destruction of the image he had fiercely guarded, Clara stood without shouting, without anger, with one thing that could no longer be taken from her: the courage that had grown, and a face that was no longer afraid to face anyone. That courage didn't erase the consequences. It invited them, one by one, like waves that could no longer be held back after a dam has cracked. The days following the big meeting felt different in every way. Michael's office, once run with a precise rhythm, was now filled with whispers and more cautious steps. The independent investigation team began its work. Official emails were sent to all divisions, requesting cooperation and guaranteeing protection for anyone willing to provide information. Michael's name wasn't mentioned as a suspect, but his authority was temporarily restricted. Major strategic decisions now required board approval. His room to maneuver was shrinking. The social pressure that once flowed downward now reversed its course. Colleagues who had always stood by him began to keep their distance. Invitations to client lunches dwindled. Conversations that were once easy became strained. The people who used to laugh the loudest at his jokes now spoke only when necessary. Michael felt it, and he brought it home with him. The first night after the announcement of his restricted authority, he came home earlier than usual. His steps were heavy, but his eyes burned with suppressed rage. "This is all your fault," he said as soon as the door closed. Clara was sitting at the dining table with a cup of warm tea in front of her. The steam was thin, almost invisible. She looked up without rushing. "Because I opened a document?" she asked calmly. "You aired our dirty laundry," Michael shot back. "You humiliated me in front of everyone." Clara paused for a moment, then said softly, "To humiliate is to do something shameful. I only showed what was already there." Michael paced back and forth. "You think they care about the truth? They were just waiting for a chance to take me down." "Maybe," she replied. "But that chance wouldn't have existed if there wasn't an opening." The sentence made Michael stop. His gaze shifted from anger to coldness. "You've changed." Clara didn't deny it. Yes, the change hadn't happened overnight. It was born from an accumulation of small insults, subtle threats, financial control disguised as efficiency. It grew from a 3-minute delay and a cup of hot coffee shattering against her face. Now that the cup was broken, its shards didn't just cut skin. They severed an illusion. The following days were filled with calls from the investigation team. Clara was asked to give an official statement. She arrived in simple clothes and with consistent answers. She didn't exaggerate, didn't add drama. She just presented the timeline and the evidence she had. Outside the office, the news began to spread through their social circles. Some old friends sent cautious messages. Some offered quiet support. Others suggested that Clara should resolve things internally for the sake of the family's good name. The family's good name. That phrase used to be enough to make Clara comply. Now she saw it as just another veil for fear. One evening, Michael tried a different approach. He was no longer angry. He sat across from Clara in the living room, his voice softer than usual. "We can fix this. I can talk to the board. We can settle this quietly. You retract your statement. I'll make sure you want for nothing." Clara looked at him for a long time. She recognized that tone, the persuasive tone that used to win her over after small arguments. "This isn't about wanting for nothing," Clara replied. "What do you want then?" Michael asked, frustration creeping back into his voice. An apology? A confession? Clara considered the question. Did she want an apology? Once, maybe. Now she realized that words of regret without real change would be just a thin patch over a massive crack. "I want the truth to be processed," she said finally. Michael shook his head. "You don't understand my world. And you never tried to understand mine," Clara countered, still without any overt emotion. That was the most profound shift. Clara no longer spoke with a pleading or defensive tone. She spoke as an equal. A few days later, the pressure turned into a veiled threat. "You know this could lead to divorce, right?" Michael said one night. "Are you prepared for that?" "For what people will say." Clara looked at him with a calmness that made Michael even more uneasy. "I already faced what people would say when you threw coffee in my face in public." Michael was silent. The sentence was a slap he couldn't dodge. "That was a moment of anger," he said quietly, almost as if defending himself to himself. "And this is a long-term consequence," Clara replied. The silence that followed was no longer frightening to Clara. She didn't feel threatened by the possibility of divorce or gossip. She had passed the point where fear was her primary controller. Outside their home, the investigation deepened. Several more staff members gave additional testimony. Old documents were reopened. The company's internal newsletter began discussing the importance of ethics and transparency. No names were mentioned, but the direction was clear. Michael started coming home later and later. His face was weary. The untouchable aura he once projected was fading, bit by bit. He was beginning to realize that a reputation built over years could crack in a matter of weeks. One night, for the first time, he wasn't angry, cajoling, or threatening. He just sat on the edge of the bed and said quietly, "I never thought you would do this." Clara stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. "I never thought you would throw hot coffee in my face." The sentence wasn't spoken with vengeance. It was stated as an irrefutable fact. Michael looked down. In his usually upright posture, there was a visible slump. But Clara knew that sympathy was no reason to back down. She had changed her position in the relationship. She was no longer living in the shadow of Michael's decisions. She no longer measured her steps based on his mood. Now, when they spoke, the power imbalance was gone. Michael might still be trying to control the situation, but he no longer controlled Clara. After that cup shattered, there was no way to piece it back together as it was. The crack had opened Clara's eyes to something bigger than a public incident. She realized that power in a relationship wasn't just about who spoke the loudest. It was about who dared to stand up when others tried to push them down. And now, amidst the ongoing investigation and the reversing social pressure, Clara stood in a different position. No longer the wife afraid of loss, but the individual who had found her own voice and had no intention of ever giving it back. That voice was now leading her to a decision that could no longer be postponed. A few weeks after the investigation began, the preliminary results were announced internally. The independent team found serious procedural violations and a pattern of pressure inconsistent with leadership ethics. Michael wasn't fired outright, but he was asked to resign to maintain company stability. The official wording was gentle, a dignified resignation, but everyone knew what it meant. He was no longer in control. The news reached the house before Michael himself could explain it. Clara read the official letter circulating among management with a calm breath. There was no sense of victory within her, just a long silence, like the pause after a storm. That night, Michael came home without his suit jacket. He wore only a white dress shirt, wrinkled at the sleeves. His face was tired, not with anger, but with something heavier. Loss. "I resigned," he said simply. Clara nodded. "I know." Michael sat in a chair at the dining room table, a place that had often witnessed his one-sided conversations. Now, the atmosphere was different. There was no invisible dominance. Just two people sitting opposite each other, each facing the consequences of their choices. "Are you satisfied now?" he asked quietly. Clara didn't answer immediately. She walked to the kitchen, poured hot water into a mug, and placed a tea bag inside. Thin wisps of steam rose slowly. She watched the simple motion with a strange focus, as if reaffirming her control over something small but real. "I didn't do this to feel satisfied," she finally said, returning to her seat. "I did it because it needed to be done." Michael gave a bitter laugh. "You destroyed my career." Clara looked at him straight on. "Your career was destroyed by your own decisions." Silence filled the room, but it was no longer an oppressive silence. It felt neutral, even honest. A few days later, Clara filed for divorce. The decision wasn't impulsive. She had been thinking about it since the night the hot coffee touched her face. Back then, she hadn't had the courage. Now, she had more than courage. She had awareness, the awareness that a marriage wasn't just about enduring, but about respect. And when respect is shattered in public, when violence is wrapped in justification, when an apology is never truly spoken with full consciousness, then all that's left is the shadow of a relationship. Michael received the news with a stiff face. "So this is the end," he said. "This is the beginning," she replied. "The beginning of a life not built on fear." She wasn't yelling, wasn't accusing. She was simply stating a boundary. The legal process unfolded as expected. There was a division of assets, long discussions with lawyers, and conversations that were sometimes exhausting. But whenever Clara felt herself waver, she remembered one thing. A 3-minute delay was no reason to be degraded. The hot coffee, she no longer remembered it as pain. She remembered it as a turning point. One morning, several months after everything was settled, Clara sat in a small cafe in a quiet corner of the city. She ordered a cup of coffee. When the server placed it on her table, its bitter aroma wafted up gently. Once, that smell might have reminded her of the stairs in the bistro where she was humiliated. Now, she just smelled coffee. She lifted the cup slowly, blowing on the steam before taking a careful sip. Its warmth touched her lips but didn't burn. She smiled faintly. Her life hadn't suddenly become perfect. There were days when loneliness visited uninvited. There were moments when she questioned her choices, but not once did she miss the fear that had once bound her. Clara started working as a freelance administrative consultant, helping small businesses overhaul their documentation systems and financial transparency. The experience that had once been painful was now a valuable asset. She understood the importance of procedure, of ethics, and of a voice brave enough to speak. Some of Michael's former employees contacted her to say thank you, not because they wanted to see him fall, but because they no longer felt alone. "We learned from you that silence isn't the only option," Ashley wrote in a short text message.